Two, one. Well, hello. Welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast, where we talk with writers from all mediums and genres about themselves, their work, and advice they have for other writers. I'm your host, Paul Zeidman, and my guest today is the author, Rachael Kelly. We're going to be talking to her about her book, Edge of Heaven. And it says R.B. Kelly, but she says, oh, it's fine. You can call me Rachel because we're all very casual around here. Rachel, welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. You know what? We'll get into your bio in just a second, but I always mess this up. As viewers and listeners are familiar with the show, we like to start things off talking about something we may have read or watched lately. Did we like it? Did we not like it? Were we kind of indifferent to it? I'll go first just to give Rachel a little time to collect her thoughts. I've been really busy reading books for the podcast, so I'm not going to get into those because those are future guests. But one of the books was Rachel's book, so I read that. But I did finish. I talked about this last time. There's a show on Amazon. It's called Has Been Hotel. It's an animated, very adult program about the daughter of Lucifer who's trying to help sinners mend their ways so they can go up into heaven. And it's very silly. And it's a musical, and it's just really fun. It's definitely do not watch it with your small children because you will regret it instantly. And kind of what led me to that was this show on. It's on YouTube and it's called Hell of a Boss. And that was the creator, Vivian Madrano's, that was her first show before she did Has Been Hotel. And they are in the second season of that. And they're now I've all caught up. So I still have, I think, 2 episodes left of the current season. But that is also, very adult, very animated, very silly, a lot of funny jokes. And highly recommended. If you like kind of dark-ish humor, I think you'd probably enjoy that. And if you like musicals, you'd probably like that one as well. So that's it from this end. So I will ask Rachel, anything good or bad that you've been watching or reading lately?
Well, we're watching Agatha all along at the
Ah,
moment,
okay.
so the follow-up to WandaVision, which I don't know how. Yeah, do I like it? I really think I do like it, but I'm just completely blown away by how I have absolutely no idea what's going on most of the time in it, which I love. It's I'm just like WandaVision. It's just one of the most like creative things I've seen make it onto sort of a mainstream streamer at the moment. It's so bonkers and off the wall. You really got to fall in love with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, before that, we just finished the latest season of Only Murders in the Building as well, which
Oh,
is
okay.
always, yeah, always quality viewing there. Um, yeah, beyond that, we're kind of boring. We watch quiz shows a lot. We watch University Challenge. I don't know how much that translates across the Atlantic, but University Challenge and a very, very sort of intellectual quiz show called Only Connect.
Hmm.
So not really narrative television viewing at all there.
Okay. Well, and as people could probably tell, Rachel, she is not in America.
I'm not,
Okay,
no.
so I will read her bio. This is in her book, Edge of Heaven. Rachel R.B. Kelly was born and raised in Northern Ireland in a home where Star Trek reruns were rarely off the television and the bookshelves were well stocked with Terry Pratchett. Her fiction and nonfiction works have appeared in magazines and journals across the world, including the Andromeda Spaceways In-Flight magazine, a variety of anthologies, and a Bridport shortlisted short story. She has a PhD in film theory, and her doctoral thesis, Mark Antony in Popular Culture, was published in 2014 by IB Tauris. Edge of Heaven is her first novel, and it was a winner of the Irish Writers' Centre Novel Fair Award. She lives outside Belfast. Now, this one says with her husband and son, but she has since informed me she now has 2 children. And again,
I
Rachel,
do.
once again, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Well, my pleasure. Okay, so Rachel, let's talk. Let's start things off talking a little bit about you. So, what is your background? Were you always a writer? Were you a lot of writers we've talked to? They were voracious readers when they were children, and it kind of developed into, oh, I'm going to try it myself and see how it goes. What is your story of like how did you become a writer?
I don't think I became a writer. I think I was born one. I don't remember a time when I wasn't telling stories. I was always that kid that was sitting there. I mean, I nagged my mother to teach me to write before I was at school because I
Ooh.
just wanted to be able to communicate. I wanted to be able to read. I wanted to be able to write. Um, if I say that I wrote my first novel at the age of 8, I want you to take that with a pinch of salt because it was very much an 8-year-old's version of a novel. It was very
Sure.
loopy, childish handwriting. And it was, of course, about a talking pony because I was an 8-year-old girl.
Ah,
Um, there was a tiger attack in it. There was tiger attack, a variety of talking animal friends, and yeah, I still have that somewhere. I haven't clapped eyes on it in many years. Nobody will ever read it,
well,
but
as it
I
should
was
be.
I was so proud of it though at the time. I cannot remember a time when I wasn't telling stories, and it's sort of I kind of discovered, like I said in the bio, science fiction has always been a huge part of my life. I mean, my dad put Star Trek in front of me at a very tender age, and I remember watching The Wrath of Khan and being deeply disturbed by. It's okay to do spoilers for The Wrath of Khan, isn't
It's
it?
only
I
a
think
40-year-old movie.
yeah, at the end where Spock dies and just being just devastated by that. And then I got my hands on Terry Pratchett as a young teenager, and the rest is history. I knew between Terry Pratchett and actually Ben Elton's early '90s sci-fi. That's when I knew those were the stories I wanted to tell,
Oh,
specifically science fiction stories. And
okay. I was gonna ask, did you have any favorite authors? But you mentioned Terry Pratchett, and
yeah,
who's the other one? Ben Elton. I mean,
Ben
what
Elton,
was it
yeah.
about their stories that was so appealing to you?
Well, I think Pratchett, because we'd always kind of had speculative fiction in the house, and we'd always kind of had speculative fiction on the television, and I had an idea of how speculative fiction was created and written and produced. And then Terry Pratchett came along. Well, didn't come along. He'd been ready for quite some time by the time I got hold of The Color of Magic. But I picked up this book, and it was everything that I loved about speculative fiction, but it was just very gently deconstructing it with so much love. And it was pointing out all of the things that we sort of, not that we take for granted about speculative fiction, but all of the things that have become kind of, well, tropes, I guess, and kind of gently skewering them. And I just, wow, this kind of blew my mind. It's like, wow, we can play with it. It's playful, and we don't have to take this completely seriously. We can tell a serious story playfully, and I absolutely fell in love with it. And around about that time, obviously this is the early '90s, and I am Generation X, and the whole idea of there being a climate crisis was just starting to kind of kick in to the popular consciousness. And at that point, I picked up This Other Eden. This is again, my dad had it lying around, and I just went, oh, that looks interesting. I'll have a look at that. And I picked that up, and immediately I was in a near future where we were looking ahead to what this could potentially look like. And I'm, okay, that is fascinating and terrifying at the same time. And I want to see if I can tell my own stories in that kind of dystopian environment that is not generically dystopian.
Hmm.
And that's what fascinates me so much about that kind of storytelling, is the dystopia where people don't necessarily know they're living in a dystopia. So you've got the post-apocalyptic stuff that's
Hmm.
and I love that. I love the Hunger Games and all of that great stuff. But they are obviously living. They know they're living in a dystopia. Their lives suck, and they know that, and the world sucks, and they know that. But it's the gentle sort of the frog in the boiling water that
Hmm.
fascinates me, where it just gently heats up and heats up and heats up and gets more and more dystopian, where nobody really kind of goes, actually, this is the point where I think we want to be concerned. And then all of a sudden you look and, you're living in the case of Edge of Heaven, you're living in a bi-level city where you never see the sunlight, and everybody's going, this is fine, this is completely normal. This is just day-to-day life. And that's what really sort of struck a chord with me with Ben Elton. And the people that are saying, this isn't okay, this is not okay, this is terrible, are being kind of vilified, and they're clearly kind of on the side of the angels, but they're not fully the good guys either. And I
Hmm.
just, it fascinated me. It changed the stories I wanted to tell.
Okay, that's fascinating stuff. I mean, I just wanted to ask one quick question. So before you were referring to speculative fiction, so how would you
Mm.
define that for people who might not be familiar with the term?
So anything that deals with the laws of sort of universal laws that are not the universal laws of physics that we know and accept to be like fact. So anything that's dealing with science that's not currently within the realm of what we can do, anything that deals with physical laws like magic, for example, or ghosts or anything like that. So speculative fiction is anything that is purely, it relies on the imagination to conceive of the rules that inform that world.
Okay. That helps. So what would you say was like, would you say was the Ben Elton book? Was that the one that really kind of like started things going for you, or was it like a whole assortment? Like, because you mentioned Terry Pratchett.
I think Ben Elton got me writing dystopian science fiction. I think Terry Pratchett has kept my tongue firmly in my cheek as I've been writing dystopian science fiction. So yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily call myself a writer of dystopian fiction. Other
Hmm.
people call me a writer of dystopian science fiction, and they're right. Yeah, I grudgingly have to admit that they're right. But because my guys don't know they're in a dystopia, I have a trouble calling it dystopian. Um, but it doesn't need to be miserable. And I quite like, sometimes I quite like to be a little bit kind of irreverent or off the cuff, or to any time that happens, that's Pratchett coming through. That's a very early sense of, we don't have to take this very seriously. We can we can have fun with this. We can poke gentle fun at it out of love.
Got it. Okay. So let's move on to your book, Edge of Heaven. So now this is your first novel, but it's got a great backstory. Now, before you get into that, so if you could give what we like to call the elevator pitch. So like
Yeah.
what is okay, I'm reading like okay, I'm looking shopping for a book. Oh, here's a little write-up by, someone who works at the bookstore. What do they have to say about it?
And this is the question that every author dreads, because we can either give like the very high level elevator pitch, or we can go into absolute verbal vomit and just tell every single thing that happened in the story. So the elevator pitch that I use is a woman called Danai Grant lives in the bi-level city of Crayobas, and she's living with a secret that if anybody finds out, she's going to die. It will cost her life. And into this dangerous world where she's living emerges. And I'm terribly sorry for talking about this subject
Oh no,
matter,
it's fine. It's fine.
the years after 2020, but emerges a new pandemic. And Danae comes to realize that, in fact, the terrible secret she's holding on to may actually be the key to stopping the pandemic. So she must make the decision: is she going to step forward and risk everything, or is she going to keep safe and say nothing?
See, that wasn't so hard, was it?
Yeah, I've practiced that quite a bit though.
That's great. Okay, so okay, now we know what the story is. So before we get into talking about the story itself, now it said that you started this quite a while ago, and
Yeah.
that it just it. What was the reason that the length of time between starting it and having a finished book in your hand?
I needed to be ready to write the story as it needed to be told. So, like I said, I mean, it was a long time. I first got the idea for it sitting in the back of my dad's car, driving through Belfast when I was 15 years old. And out of nowhere, my brain went, what if you could build a city in two layers? And I went, ooh, that's interesting. Never knew what to do with it. I started writing a story because that's just what I did. There were stories pouring out of me in my teens, and I started to write this. But this was the first time I tried to write something that was sort of quote unquote grown up.
Hmm.
So it wasn't writing for a teen audience. I was deliberately writing for an adult audience. I didn't know how to do that when I was 15 because I wasn't an adult. And I thought that how you wrote for adults, when as a teenager, I thought how you wrote for adults was you put a lot of swearing in and maybe some naughty bits. So I did that, and it was, I mean, it was objectively really not good at all.
Hmm.
Um, and I went on to write other things. Like I said, there were stories pouring out of me at that point, but there was something about that stuck with me, and I was fascinated by all the concepts that I started to explore. I saw Blade Runner around this time as well, which also started to shape my sort of my desire to talk about things like identity and what it means to be human. And where does that line lie? If we start to create artificial intelligences so powerful that they can mimic human beings to the point where we can't tell the difference. That's the Turing test, isn't it? At what point do we have to then treat them as humans and not artificial intelligence or artificial creations? And all of that was kind of percolating in the back of my mind. And I wrote lots of other stories on that theme. Some of them I may even develop at some point again. But all of that was going on. And I was revising this and I was getting better at writing, I guess. So there's the enthusiasm that comes before you know what you're doing and before you have that voice in your head that's going, actually, this isn't really what you want to say or the way you want to say it. And
Hmm.
that enthusiasm just poured into draft after draft after draft. I set it aside for quite a long time. And then around about 2009, so the swine flu pandemic, um, and because the novel concerns a pandemic, I suddenly felt like, oh, bless my innocent sort of 2009 self. I thought that I was watching sort of research play out in real time here. So I then started to seriously revise it and seriously start to kind of look at making it better. And I knew a lot more about writing at that point, and I knew a lot more about myself as a writer. Um, and I think that was really when I started to realize that I like this. I think this might be the one that I want to be my first novel. So we went from 2009 to 2016 when I first got a publisher, and obviously that one didn't work out. But no, it was a really useful experience, and it got me the leverage then to find its current publisher in 2020. So it was a really, really long gestation period. And then just because of the way these things work, I released my pandemic novel in April 2020, which was just magnificent timing. So yeah, the world wasn't really in the mood, I think, in April 2020 to read about a pandemic.
Hmm.
But fortunately, I have a great publisher who refused to give up on me, and just you kept working away, and ultimately it ended up being shortlisted for the Arthur C. Clarke that year, um, which uh, indescribable.
I can imagine that that is quite an accomplishment. I did want to ask, so the scientific aspect aside, I mean, like focusing on the story and the events of the story, was that kind of fully formed, or were you just kind of like, okay, time would go on, I'm just going to jot down a few ideas, and then after a while, you just realize, oh, I've got so much to work with here. I think I can start putting it all together, like finding the way to put this puzzle together.
That's a really interesting question because the process that was involved in creating those earlier drafts is completely different from the process that was involved in putting together the drafts that ended
Hmm.
up being publishable. And in those earlier drafts, it was literally whatever idea comes to me, and I was working it out as I went. I had no idea really what story I wanted to tell at that
Hmm.
point. And quite honestly, that first draft is basically Blade Runner fan fiction.
Okay.
I was very impressionable at that age. But the more the more I started to kind of isolate the key ideas that interested me the most, and about these ideas about humanity and what it means to be human, and just the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, and how that might play out, and also just the societal aspect of living in a climate changed world. What's that going to look like? What's that going to look like for the little guys? What's that going to look like for society as a whole?
Hmm.
How does one survive in a society where there really just aren't the resources anymore, but nobody is calling it. It's not Mad Max, it's not Thunderdome time, but very quietly resources are dwindling, and
Hmm.
nobody's really saying that out loud. So we're just kind of squeezing and squeezing and squeezing. So that kind of fed into then how those later drafts developed, and I started to be much more strategic and clear about what the story was that I wanted to tell. So by the time I got a draft that was sort of halfway decent, the draft that I was able to give to my two very, very wonderful friends, who it was a monster, it was a beast of a novel. It was, I think it was north of 200,000 words.
Oh.
And they very, very kind, I know, they very kindly read it and went, yeah, that's not working. Or, yeah, no, love that. That's definitely not working.
Hmm.
And that feedback was what enabled me to put together a draft that was ultimately publishable.
Okay. I one of the things I really noticed, two things that really sprung to mind was that you have some very intense world building.
Oh, thank
You get to
you.
get into that from the get-go. Now, was that a challenge to take on, or was that something like you already had it established in your head and you were like, okay, I just got to figure out a way to get it from here down onto the page?
So world building is my favorite part of science fiction writing. um, I didn't know that at the time that I started putting this world together. So fortunately, by the time I realized just how much information I needed to have about the
Hmm.
world in order to write it the way I wanted to write it, I'd already done all of that work accidentally as a teenager. And it just kind of developed from there and built from there. But world building is one of the things that I love most about creating, speculative worlds, because it's not just a question of, right, here's the setting. The setting is a character. It's a major character in the piece. So one needs to do as much work as one would do on a major character in the piece. One needs to understand not just the surface level stuff, but all of the stuff that the reader will never see, which feeds into the power structures that make the society function the way it does, by who holds authority and by what means and by what by whose agreement, and how does language and dialect play into that, and how is access to knowledge controlled, and how does that impact on who holds the power? All of those things that will never actually make it into the text, but which, as a reader or as a writer, I need to know that in order to feel
Hmm.
like I can walk those streets. And I really need to feel like I can walk the streets of a place before I can write it. And it's one of the most exciting things for me. I mean, I can't sketch to save myself, but I always have like a little map. It's really, really bad. It's this awful little honeycomb nonsense with like sort of districts scratched out on it, just
Hmm.
so that I know what's next to what and how people would get and where the gates might be between the different districts, and how, if you wanted to take a subway from Fiore to Punta Este, what stops would you need to get off at? It's that level of detail that I will never be on the page, but
Hmm.
which I find it one of the most enjoyable aspects of writing science fiction.
Well, that is one of the things I did really notice about the story is that the intense attention to detail. It's not just it's not just describing like anything in particular. It's almost to the point of describing everything in detail.
Yes.
But the thing is that it all adds to the story. Now, is that just, as you said, that you just love the world building aspect. Now, is that just part of your writing style, or just kind of you felt like this is the proper way to present this story?
That's a really interesting question, actually. And I'm not sure I'd have the same answer for another setting as I would for this novel.
Hmm.
Because with this novel, the setting was so integral to the narrative that without, like I said, it is basically a character in the narrative. So for me, I think, yeah, it would be proper to have that level of detail, because without that level of detail, um, does the reader have enough information to understand the
Hmm.
space? Would I do it the same were I writing it again? I might cut some of the detail out. Um,
Hmm.
Again, it's about learning and sort of developing, I suppose, as a writer. But what I try to do is be strategic in how that detail weaves its way into the story. I will try not to have a big wall of prose, expository prose, wherever I can possibly avoid it. I will
Hmm.
try and motivate that expository prose by something that's happening in the narrative. So whether it's a character beat, somebody looking at something with anger and their anger reflects how they are viewing that space, or whether it's woven into movement through the space for a narrative beat, a chase scene or something like that. I'll try and do that as much as possible. But again, without the detail, I can't visualize it, and I want the reader to be able to visualize it. And I just want them to be able to walk through it with me.
Okay. No, I totally get that. So one of the things I also wanted to ask you is that a lot of times the events of the story did not play out the way I was expecting them to, especially as we get closer towards, I guess, past the halfway point, where things suddenly change, and you're expecting the story to turn right, but it makes a hard left. Now, was that something you kind of came up with as you went along, or did you kind of know from the outset this is how I want the story to go, or was it kind of like you would be writing and figure, oh, okay, this just isn't working. I need to go back. I need to find the point where things started to go screwy.
Um, Again, that is probably a relic of it being so many drafts
Hmm.
before completion.
Okay.
Because I find it quite difficult at this stage to remember how much of that. I knew when
It's
I
all
wrote
a
it
blur now.
originally. It's all a blur. So I did have some really definite ideas about the main character Danae and how much agency I wanted her to have, and for that not to be lip service.
Hmm.
And for her to actually to kind of invert the power dynamic between the male and female characters. Um, so without giving spoilers away, I would really be interested to hear which bits didn't go the way you thought they were going to go, because I'm really pleased about that. But off the top of my head, I cannot think of any time I sat down to deliberately invert reader expectation. I'm thrilled that I did, though.
Okay. I will not give any spoilers away either, but I think that when you start off reading a story like this, and it's very dark and gritty to begin with, you almost expect, okay, you are wondering, is the writer going to keep it that way as we continue to the end, or are they going to, is it going to be a happy ending, or at least an ending that inspires hope? And I'm not going to give anything away because that's you need to read the book to find out what happens. But I think it's also the question of as you were developing the story, did you and you were also said you had readers who were, yeah, I guess, giving you feedback. Did any of them make any suggestions that kind of like turned on that light bulb that, oh, that's brilliant. If I do that, then I can definitely take it to here, and then I just have to make some changes here. I mean, was it all? I don't know. I'm trying to, not that it was a group effort, but was it, did you
Mm-hmm.
have, you presented the book to readers and then they made suggestions that, in your opinion, made it better?
Yeah, so the suggestions that they made were not at a narrative level.
Hmm.
A lot of it was to get rid of a lot of info dump, which
Ah, okay.
I was very guilty of that. Um, so the narrative direction that it takes, that was pretty set from. And if we're talking about the ending in particular, that ending, I fought for that ending
Hmm.
a couple of times. I was very clear that that's how I wanted it to play out. And I think if that's what we're talking about, yes, that was a deliberate effort to invert reader expectation when I think
Ah,
about that.
okay.
Um, and it wasn't that I mean, I always knew I would write more in this series. I always knew there was more story to tell. So it wasn't necessarily a deliberate attempt to set up another story. It wasn't not a deliberate attempt to set up another story, but it was specifically that was the ending that this story had to have in order to be true to the character of Danae, and to be true to the journey that she'd taken, and to be true to the trauma that journey had involved for her. Um, it didn't feel like there was like a neat bow that could be put on the end of it. And there was a level, a degree of where I didn't want to wrap it up too neatly.
Hmm.
Um, however, the yeah, no, that there was no point really where there was narrative, like huge narrative structural change happened after I gave it to readers.
Okay. Well, I usually ask this a little later in the show, but I'm going to ask you now because you brought it up. So the book is Edge of Heaven, but now apparently there's another, like the next chapter, the next book.
Yes,
So
yes,
can you kind
yes.
of give a little, a few tidbits of information about that one?
Okay, so the again, I mean, I don't like calling it a sequel, even though it is a sequel, but it doesn't feel like it's a sequel. It's what happened next rather than a continuation of that story. I always knew there was more story to tell, and there's a
Mhm.
prequel as well that's currently somewhere around about 40% written. Um, so without spoiling the end of Edge of Heaven, it's a bit difficult to talk in too much detail about On the Brink, but it does pick up a couple of months after the events of Edge of Heaven. It picks up with Dana again, and it really just follows you. What would it look like for you if you had been through that experience? And because I wanted to kind of honor the 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 journey that she'd been on. I didn't want to kind of sweep it under the carpet. She'd made some decisions that were incredibly impactful for the life that she had chosen to keep herself safe. She sort of, she a lot of that kind of exploded as a result of her decisions. And what does that look like for her now? How does that how does that impact her ability to function in a society where she can no longer feel as safe as she wants to feel or she needs to feel. So it does follow her out of Cryobas, and in fact, it's I've taken this one into an orbital city, which the orbital cities are referenced a couple of times in the original novel. But yeah, I wanted to have a look at an orbital city, and that one flowed very much from a summer I spent in the Netherlands, my early 20s, where I just fell in love with the country. I don't know necessarily that some of the ways I've constructed the city of Lykstad necessarily feels very loving. It's supposed to be a love letter, but again, if the earth can't sustain crop cycles anymore with any kind of regularity or reliability, how do you produce crops and how do you produce plants? So the idea of this sort of orbital growing city, I worked in a bulb factory in the Netherlands. I packed flower bulbs for a summer, which it was way more fun than it sounds. And so that's what Dana does. She packs flower bulbs in an orbital city, an orbital Dutch-speaking city that's of Lykstad, and she undertakes the next stage of her journey.
Do you have any idea when you're hoping to have that done, or is it's just there's no way to
That's
tell right
out.
now?
That's out and released now. So
Oh, it is. Okay.
it is, yeah. So one can buy that at any good bookstore, I guess.
Okay. Oh,
Well,
only because I thought you said it was like 40% done, or is
no,
that
that's the
another?
prequel. Oh,
Oh,
that's
the
the
prequel.
prequel.
Okay, my mistake.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, that's there's a prequel that's about 40% done, but when that's going to be complete,
No, no.
I'm writing
Okay,
something else now.
that's perfectly fine. So one of the things I was kind of digging around your website, which is rbkelly.co.uk, that you identify as a neurodivergent author. Now, I've heard the term, but could you kind of explain it in layman's terms? Because I'm sure people have heard it, but they're kind of like, I kind of know what it is, but a more definitive explanation would probably help.
So it's a catch-all term really for lots of different uh, brain patternings, I suppose. So I have OCD. That's diagnosed, and I'm awaiting assessment for autism, which even to get on the list for to get assessed for that in this part of the world, you have to be pretty clear that you probably are. So
Mm.
I think I very much am. Um, and that is something like the OCD I've known for a long, long time. The autism has been a much more recent kind of revelation that has sort of explained kind of everything. So just kind of embracing that side now, and I feel like I really do want to be very positive about that because it's a huge part of who I am and how I write as well, and the characters that I've written, and the stories that I want to tell. So it's something that I do feel very strongly about talking about wherever possible, although it is something that I'm just now starting to talk about publicly. So
Okay. Would you say that that has had like an impact or an influence on the way you write? I mean, just kind of like, that you're maybe like especially the OCD, like that contributes because like, we were talking about like how much detail you put into the work. Would you say that's a
yes.
reflection of that?
Yeah, very much so. I overthink much? Yes, absolutely. Do I overthink every single word that I put on the page? I very much do. Yeah. But there is also the case that there is kind of a push pull there as well. It was
Hmm.
the order and the what's the word I'm looking for? It's a very ordered approach and a very programmatical, I guess, approach to writing
Hmm.
is what gets me through those the bursts. I mean, every writer encounters, whether you call it writer's block, whether you call it marathon of the middle, whether you call it I don't know, the muse has left me, all of
Hmm.
those moments. I think they're very programmatic. And I plot like a woman possessed, and which took me a long time to realize that that was my best possible approach to this.
Hmm.
But unless I have a very structured approach to it, then I know that my brain is going to be it's going to feel too chaotic, and it's going to just shoot off, and I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm not going to be able to persuade myself to show up when the going gets tough. So I think that very much plays a part. And yeah, I think different things that I've been learning about, and different kind of synesthesia and
Hmm.
different approaches to sensory stuff, which I just thought were normal. I thought everybody was like that, and then all of a sudden people are going, "No, Rachel, that's just you." So I mean, and I've been teaching this stuff. I've been teaching this stuff in writing classes for nearly 10 years, and a lot of writers have been going, "Oh yeah, absolutely." So do you know what? I think there's probably more of us undiagnosed than we necessarily would have thought. But yeah, I think there is a lot of that that's in my writing, and because it's only been in the past sort of 5 or so years that it's even been a consideration. I haven't been doing it consciously, and I'm only now starting to unpack how much of that actually has poured itself into the novels, and the characters that I've written.
Hmm. Okay. I did want to ask you about that. In addition to being an author, that you're also a writing instructor, as well as an editor and a mentor. So, one of the things that I like to ask of people who teach writing, is there like a common issue you see from writers, especially writers who are just starting out? I mean, it doesn't have to be, a character, it doesn't have to be a personality flaw, but is it kind of like something about their writing that, it's too basic, or they're, I don't know, they're not, you don't think they're living up to their potential? I mean, is there something that really kind of strikes you, is it that you see a lot of?
What I see a lot of, I think, with emerging authors that I work with, and I do predominantly work almost exclusively with emerging authors who are just starting to write and
Hmm.
just starting to work on their first novels.
Sure.
What I see mostly there that I kind of wish I could scream from the hilltops is there is no one size fits all approach to writing. There, just because I plot like a woman possessed doesn't mean that other people should do
Hmm.
that. But a lot of the time, I'm finding authors are coming to me because they have not necessarily known where to get started, and they've picked up a book, and maybe it's been the right book for them, maybe it's been the process that just clicked with them immediately, but more often than not it's a process that isn't necessarily right for them, and they kind of internalize the fact that, well, I'm not working like this, so therefore I must be wrong.
Mm.
And the amount of times I've had an author start working with me and go, look, I'm not doing this right, I need you to teach me how to do it right. There is no right way, there's the way that's right for you. So the only process that's wrong in terms of writing is the process that's not generating words for you. And if they are trying to write to a plot, if they're trying to plot in advance, I mean, I don't like to talk about plotters and pantsers
Hmm.
because I think pantsers feels like it's inherently negative. I like to talk about gardeners and architects, and I've got that
Oh.
from somebody, but I can't remember where. It's not my own original thought, but I can't remember whose it is. But I like to think about gardeners and architects because I think that's a much nicer way of looking at it. A gardener isn't somebody who writes by the seat of their pants. A gardener is someone who plants a story seed, and they have no control really over what shape that grows into. But as long as they keep watering it and they keep nurturing it, it will grow into something magnificent. And it may look totally different from what they thought it would be when they planted that seed. But ultimately, if you were to ask them, right, sit down and tell me how that is going to look when it's finished growing, they can't do it.
Hmm.
So the amount of times writers came to me and went, I don't know how this ends. Tell me what to do. Well, write it. Write it and find out. Well, do you do that? Well, no, but I'm different from you. And the story, I mean, I do love to talk about Ian Rankin, the crime writer, Ian Rankin,
Hmm.
the Scottish crime writer, wrote the Inspector Rebus novels. And I heard him talk a couple of years ago, and he confirmed what I'd heard rumors of, that he does not know when he starts to write a Rebus book how it's going to end. He is a gardener all the way, and it's done him no harm whatsoever. These really tight, intricately plotted detective novels that he finds the story as he goes. So if it works for Ian Rankin, it can work for anybody. Just because my planning looks like like a murder board doesn't mean that's how everybody's novel should look from the start. So I mean that's the key thing, that I just find your own process, find what works for you, experiment, explore. Maybe you do like a bit of structure. Maybe that is what's going to work for you, but there's lots and lots of different structures that you can use. It doesn't have to be the hero's journey. It doesn't have to be Freytag's pyramid. It doesn't have to be Save the Cat. It can be the one that works for you. And also let your first draft be messy. Let it be as messy as it needs to be. You're
Well,
not going to get it perfect in first go, and that doesn't mean anything about how good the final draft is going to be.
well, that is why they call it the vomit draft. So
Exactly, the junk draft. Yeah.
yeah, because
Yeah.
I was going to say that because I've talked to a lot of the writers we've had on the show that some of them have said, you know, I can't write without an outline. I'm one of those people. I
Mm-hmm.
because my thing is
Mm-hmm.
screenplays and I need an
Yeah.
outline because I
Yeah.
can't just like I'm not one of those writers who says I'm just going to let the characters dictate how things
Mm-hmm.
go. I can't do that. But I've
Mm-hmm.
also talked to writers who are like who say that and it's worked for them. So
Yeah.
as what you were saying, finding the right process for you is that you know, you may be a big admirer of this author or that screenwriter, but that doesn't mean that you should try to emulate what they do because that's what works for them. Because I've seen this in so many newer writer screenplays that you know I'm a big fan of Quentin Tarantino, so I'm going to write just like him. I'm like, well, yeah, but then you're just ripping him off. You're that's not
Exactly.
that you're trying to write in his voice, not in your own. And so
Yeah.
a writer has to find you know the best way that they can get their voice to come through on the page
Yeah.
in whatever way they can.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. That's the other thing. I mean, I find a lot of writers, when I talk about writer's voice, they'll go, "Oh, I don't have one of those. I don't know what mine sounds like." Well, I mean, I explode that out of the water in the first exercise I do with them, where I ask them to describe a room, like the room that we're sitting in, and each and every one of them will draw out a different aspect of that room and describe it in a different way, or compare it to a different thing, or bring in a different emotional nuance. And
Hmm.
each and every one of them comes at it with a completely different voice. And I go, see, you didn't know, but you are, you know, we are a storytelling species. Yeah, the first stuff that you write is probably not going to be publishable, but the more you do it, the better you get. The best way to be a writer is just to keep writing.
Definitely. So I did want to ask, so a lot of the stuff that you've worked in has been science fiction. Now, I have to ask, is there a genre or genres that you've never tried before but would love to give a go at? You know, like, oh, I want to write a fantasy. I want to write a real bodice ripper of a romance novel.
I would love to write a bodice ripper. I would absolutely love to write just, I don't know, Regency romance or something like that.
Hmm.
Just a real happy ever after. I mean, I don't get me wrong. Like I said, I love writing the science fiction, but I would love to write something where I can just follow the steps of a happy couple just getting
Hmm.
together. That just sounds nice. And I know there's a lot, I mean, there's huge amounts of skill goes into, I'm not in any way claiming that romance is easy. It's definitely not. I think it's one of those things that it looks easy if it's being done well, but it's absolutely not easy, and that's why it looks like it's easy. But yeah, no, I feel like I would love to have a go at romance.
Well, just start with the lady of the manor and the handsome stable boy, and you're
Yeah,
halfway there.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Rachel, I have one last question. You do mention also on your website, rbkelly.co.uk, that Northern Ireland has a rich tradition of science fiction writing. Now, who are some authors that you recommend? And also have to ask, like, why do you think that it just happens to be that there's so many sci-fi authors out of the Northern Ireland area?
I think it's probably a little bit presumptuous of me just to claim Northern Ireland as because I mean Ireland as a whole it's a hugely rich tradition of storytelling and
Mm,
speculative storytelling, and I think oftentimes because sci-fi is it's not really nation specific,
mm,
we don't tend to have that association with you, the place and the writer. But I mean, I'm really proud to be part. I mean, this is where C.S. Lewis is from.
mm.
C.S. Lewis grew up just down the road from where I live at the moment. In fact, he died. Did he die on my birthday? Or was it the day before my birthday? Yeah. Honestly, science fiction writers just drop like flies around my birthday. Roald Dahl died on my birthday as well.
Wow.
I don't know whether I'm some kind of literary jinx or whether it was written in the stars that I had to go down this path. I can't decide. I think Doctor Who might have debuted on my birthday as well. Anyway, yeah,
November
there was no other
22nd?
option for me. 23rd. So
Ah,
yeah,
see, you missed it,
yes, yeah.
missed it by that much.
I know. One day out. But yeah, so I think probably it was written in the stars. There was no other option for me. I had to go down the path of science fiction. But yeah, so C.S. Lewis, obviously the Narnia series, which I grew up on. But then there's also, writing today. There's Ian MacDonald. I was, a friend of mine. Actually lived around the corner from him for many years. There's Joe Zebedee, who's writing fantastic stuff, which is basically blowing up bits of Ireland, but alien invasions coming in, blowing up Belfast, and she's blowing up Rathlin Island as well recently. Biddy Lee, she's doing a lot, and then obviously there's James White. There's all those guys. A couple of years ago, a guy called Jack Fennell. Now he's in Dublin, but he published a book called A Brilliant Void, in which he collected science fiction stories, early science fiction stories from Ireland. So it goes back to the early 1800s. It's something we have always done as a nation. And I think there is something to do with that rich tradition of folklore and mythology that kind of feeds into the language and the traditions, and that sort of prompts that gaze towards the speculative. I don't know. But Fennell's argument was that because of that rich tradition of folklore and mythology, a lot of these earlier stories got miscategorized. So they were never called science fiction or even speculative fiction. They were called folkloric or mythical. And so it's part of this kind of process of reclaiming that heritage. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm delighted to add my name to that list. Even to be spoken about in the same sentence as some of those guys is just like mind blowing.
Okay. Well, Rachael Kelly, what I usually like to wrap things up with is asking the guest if they have a piece of advice for writers, but you kind of already did that by talking about finding the right process for you, like finding your own voice. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just be a magpie, I guess. So, but instead of collecting shiny things, collect shiny experiences. You never know what experience is going to be the exact thing that a character needs to flesh out that character, to make them come to life, or a setting needs to be the thing that makes your reader feel like they can walk through that door and see the space. There's all these little details that happen around us. Anything can be inspiration, literally anything. So I just magpie it, hold on to it, collect it, write it down somewhere, capture it, and just, you never know when it's going to become the next story.
Oh, that's great stuff. So again, the book is Edge of Heaven and is R.B. Kelly, but she's also Rachel, so don't let the R fool you. Rachel, where can people find you online to find out more about you and all of the books that you offer, and also maybe about some of your writing instruction courses?
Yes, so primarily my website, www.rbkelly.co.uk. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram at rachel.b.kelly on Instagram and Rachael Kelly Writer on Facebook. I'm really bad at social media, but I'm trying to get better. So if you don't hear from me for a long, long period of time, I probably haven't died and been eaten by my cat. It's probably just because I've got really bad at it again.
Or they could just contact you directly through the website.
Or they can contact me directly in a less dark note, yes.
Okay, which is, again is rbkelly.co.uk. Well,
yes.
Rachael Kelly, thank you so much for being here. This has been great stuff. And again, the book, you can get it on Amazon or get it directly through Rachel. It's Edge of Heaven. It is a tome. It is a if it is an intense
stopper.
read, but if as Rachel was saying, but if you like that dystopian kind of sci-fi fiction, this is a book you're going to really love because it's got all of that, underground cities and conspiracy and intrigue and stuff in the dark. All that fun stuff is all over the place. Rachel, once again, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, wonderful. My pleasure as well. And viewers and listeners, if you enjoyed today's show, please hit like. Feel free to leave a comment and subscribe. As for my social media, you can check out my screenwriting blog, which is maximumz.blog. I'm still on Twitter for now, at maximum_Z. The show still has its own Twitter account at podcast CWL. But we have made the jump over to Blue Sky. I'm at Pez Screenwriting, PEZ, and also podcast CWL on Blue Sky as well. And I'm also on Instagram at Pez Screenwriting. And please feel free to check out my Go Ahead and Ask books on Amazon, the ones about screenwriting and pie. Like I said, that's Rachel. I'm Paul. This has been the Creative Writing Life Podcast. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and most importantly, go write something.